B. This is the absolute last one for the semester, and we're covering the rest or the second half of the viruses. So first, let's talk a little bit about rotavirus. This is essentially life-threatening diarrhea in children, and just like RSV are in younger kids, that was 1 and under, rotavirus is in children that are 2 years of age or under. So the symptoms develop acutely, meaning very quickly, and essentially what happens is the children get vomiting and diarrhea to the point that dehydration and death can in fact kick in. If you take a look at the numbers, there's about 3 million cases of children a year having diarrhea, and 20 to 100 of those end up in fatalities. It might sound like a lower number, but considering this is dying from essentially extreme diarrhea, it's pretty problematic. A lot of this has to do with hygiene and sanitation. So it isn't simple to just basically wipe things off with a Lysol wipe or clean it with 10% bleach water. This is very prevalent in child care centers, those areas in the mall where the children play, or the toys in, say, a doctor's office. This happens to be a naked virus, which implies that it isn't so easy to kill it by a basic standard infection. The one last thing I want to mention is on the bottom here is that most kids by the age of 3 have already had it, and then subsequent infections, meaning when they get rotavirus the second or the third or the fourth time, it decreases tremendously in severity. This is a digestive system impacting virus. So next we're going to talk about hepatitis. Short is HAV for hepatitis A, that's hepatitis B, and hepatitis C. I'd like you to focus on all of the writing on the bottom portion here that's in red, because that's exactly what I'm going to focus on when I test you. So hepatitis A is transmission is that it is foodborne, and you have viral shedding occurring 2 weeks prior to symptoms. So the incubation takes at least 2 weeks to about a month, on average a month, and therefore you could be asymptomatic before and the virus is still shedding. And once things occur, it is in an acute fashion. So for hepatitis B, it's a little bit different. This, instead of being fecal, oral, and foodborne, is with blood and other body fluids. This one is acute, but can in fact lead to chronic, which means it's ongoing and persistent and lives within the body longer. Hepatitis C is actually considered an STI, one of the common ways that people have gotten hepatitis C, because this is in fact bloodborne. Here it says blood and blood products. Ooh, that's a little sloppy. Sorry about that. So blood and blood products is through dirty needles when they are getting tattoos, for example. This one is a chronic condition, so it can last for quite a while and is associated with liver cancer. The one important thing to keep in mind is 80% of people have no signs or symptoms. So especially with hepatitis A, which is, again, foodborne, it's very simple to pass on during a hygiene issue of a restaurant worker where their hands are not clean. A little bit more information about hepatitis A. So with hepatitis A and B and C, it tends to cause issues in multiple parts of the body, not just in one. So for Hep A, it's transported to the liver. And then again, we can discuss blood and other body fluids. Remember, this is in fact the foodborne one. So this can cause acute food as well as waterborne illnesses. And please keep in mind right here on the side, the incubation period is anywhere from about 2 weeks to 2 months. Next, we have rabies virus. And nowadays, as written right here for you, less than 10% of the cases that are found in infected patients in the U.S., it is not because of domesticated animals. So less than 10% on domesticated animals are your cats and your dogs. It affects absolutely all areas of the body and ultimately impacts the nervous system. So if you take a look, how is this actually gotten, or how do you contract this? There is an animal, this shows a dog, which is interesting since I just said less than 10% are domesticated, so we're going to say a raccoon or potentially a fox. One of these animals has the virus and then it bites you. When it bites you at the site of the muscle where you've been bitten, the virus begins to replicate, then moves through the peripheral nervous system and many other organ systems within the body, and eventually the brain is actually impacted. If you take a look at this map of the United States, it shows you in each area which animals tend to, at a highest level, carry the rabies virus. So there is a treatment for this. It's a very long series of shots given in the abdominal area It's painful. If you look at an animal, if you've read Stephen King or seen movies where rabies was involved, you'll often notice the foaming of the mouth of the saliva for the animal that happens to be infected. So next we're going to look for a second at the West Nile virus. This is one of the few viruses we'll talk about where it actually has a vector, and the vector is a mosquito. And there's also a reservoir host, which is a bird, where it tends to just live. And the mosquito and the bite is how it actually transfers to us. This is a little bit more common in some of our southern states, but this map is as of summer of 2014. If you go 10 years back, it's not very common. When you hear West Nile virus, the name actually comes from the area where it was first discovered. Then we have something like encephalitis, which is also a hemorrhagic fever, where you are bleeding from every orifice or hole within your body. There is also a vector here, and the vector happens to be either a tick or a mosquito, so getting stung by one of them, they're infected, then it spreads throughout the body. All of the very specific signs and symptoms show up. There's a very specific rash related to it. Notice that hepatitis is also written here. This is your liver, so this ends up transporting itself throughout the body, and when you have this type of hemorrhagic fever, it's systemic. So next we're going to take a look at EBV, which is short for Epstein-Barr virus. This one has a nickname, so realize I haven't mentioned that for many of them. One of the nicknames are kissing disease. Its more scientific name is mononucleosis, or for short, it's just simply referred to as mono. This is tested for using the fluorescent antibodies. That's how it's detected. This is obviously an envelope virus, and here, where everything fluoresces in green, you can see that the virus is showing up. The signs and symptoms of Epstein-Barr virus, or mono, obviously it is contracted through contact. This is very common in contact sports where bodily fluids are. For example, think of wrestling with a wrestling mat that has the sweat and the saliva potentially of your competitor. It occurred in my daughter's swim team, actually, and one of the big signs in the person is their tonsils, their different lymph nodes. Tonsils is where it tends to start. It's swollen, it's a little bit painful, and there's a level of tiredness that hits the patient. So tiredness isn't you and I being lazy and we don't want to wake up and do our laundry. It's the level of tiredness that, for example, you're laying on the couch resting and you have to urinate. You refuse to walk to the restroom. Your body just physically cannot get up to use the restroom, and you happen to urinate or defecate yourself on the couch because it's a level of tiredness that is beyond anything you can envision as someone just being tired. So some of the specifics for Epstein-Barr virus, or again, as it's known as mono or the kissing disease, is that it's transmitted via direct contact. 95% of adults come in contact with it in very mild forms. Every time you have a fever, if you touch your throat, there might be some soreness by your lymph nodes. It produces infectious mononucleosis. This is highly communicable, and it infects specifically salivary glands as well as your lungs. Little bit more information about this guy is that it occurs worldwide, meaning it's global, not in just one area. 95% of adults between the ages of 35 and 40 have been infected or come in contact with it at some point. Here are, again, the signs and symptoms. So fever, fatigue, sore throat, and swollen glands, because remember, the lymph glands and the salivary glands are the two where you notice the most pain, but the fatigue is an abnormal amount of fatigue. I'm going to bring this up and mention it because when we talk about sequelae, which I have cut out the cancer portion because of the oddity of switching modality for the class, but when we talk about cancer, sequelae is something that's relevant and important. So I need for you to know that Epstein-Barr virus is a form of herpes virus. It falls into the same family, and it is in fact associated with cancer. So oftentimes the virus can shed and continue shedding from particular infected cells within the body. So I'm not going to cover this area down here, but I would ask that just out of sheer curiosity, you look over it and take a look, because a lot of times you'll hear that someone has a lymphoma or Hodgkin's or Burkitt's lymphoma, and what's the difference and where is it more common to or endemic to. So please take a look at this just as a future reference when it comes up in your later studies. So CMV, I believe this is the last virus we're going to be talking about, and CMV is short for cytomegalovirus. That should be one word, it just didn't fit. Cyto is cells. When you hear the word mega, you should think incredibly large. It's CMV for short. There are a few things about this particular virus that I need for you to be familiar with. Number one, it infects every single organ in the body, 100% of the organs. It's the most common congenital infection in the United States, meaning it's passed to the fetus through the placenta, and the child is born with it, so it passes during the development or embryological process. Traditionally, there are a lot of asymptomatic infections, so you may or may not even necessarily realize that you have it. CMV is an equal opportunity virus, so it is found universally or globally. There is no impact based on socioeconomic class, race, gender, culture, religion. It is just everywhere and impacts everybody, regardless of your SCS. It infects 50 to 85% of adults by the age of 40 years old. So traditionally, when the person gets infected, you take a look at here on the bottom, once the person gets infected, the virus stays there, but it tends to be dormant. So this falls also into the herpes virus family, but remember, viruses are categorized based on their genetic material characteristics, enveloped or naked, the type of spikes they may or may not have. So this is not a form of type 1 and type 2 herpes, the oral and genital that we've discussed before. It just happens to fall into the herpes family. So this is a tidbit that I need you to know about CMV. Incredible ability to infect lots of tissue types. If you take a look here, we have digestive system, respiratory, your eyes, your brain, absolutely every single part. And when we talk about mode of transmission, it requires close, intimate contact. So whether that's saliva, urine, bodily, such as seminal fluids, every single thing allows it to pass on. It can be considered an XTI or sexually transmitted. Why? Because it can pass through sexual intercourse and seminal fluids or vaginal fluids. And it can also go from mother to baby through breast milk, as well as transplanted organs. The transplanted organs is an important one to bring up because there are very specific tests that are done for cytomegalovirus when a person is about to receive a transplanted organ, because it will break down the organ and potentially kill the recipient of this organ if the person that is donating it or the donor has or has had CMV. So some variety of infections that are related to CMV, again based on the concept of sequelae, which again is that secondary infection, are chickenpox, shingles, and Shigella.